The greatest rock star in history is typically considered Elvis Presley. That's a name that I would say comes up more often. You could make the case for Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. You can push the period back a little bit, maybe for Chuck Berry or Jerry Lee Lewis. If you really want to stretch it and get out of the realm of strict rock and rock and roll, maybe you can make the case for Michael Jackson or maybe even Frank Sinatra, which maybe kind of was the one who was very open into the public and got away with some things that others wouldn't have. You might make another case or two. Buddy Rich was a little bit kind of like this. Among the early jazz performers who took off or who shed some conventions, especially with the dress code, but not so outrageous. However, long before any of these was even born, before even the notion and the concept of a rock star existed, in 1732, Joseph Haydn was born in a small village of Austria, not far from Hungary, into a fairly common family, freemen, not vassals, not peasants. And they recognized his musical gifts early on in childhood. They used to organize singing groups in the village and in the church. And so his parents recognized his musical talents, and they were able to send him. They actually even moved, which was pretty difficult and not very common in those days, but they moved somewhere else where he could get a better musical education, and they set him on his education. He learned certain instruments, he learned composition, and he advanced. He started his career. Of course, there were some struggles in the beginning, and he secured himself a post as a music teacher in a fairly well-to-do area for an aristocratic family. And he started to teach them, and through that he advanced, and his reputation slowly started to grow and come out, and he became acquainted with the aristocracy of that time and that area. And he advanced, he got better posts, he got acquainted with fairly well-connected people, and his reputation started to grow until he became a really very well recognized and very well respected composer. In fact, he was even the mentor in some sense of some of the most famous classical composers, Mozart, Beethoven, among others. Of course, that came a little bit later. And his fortunes really started to change when he got to the attention of a very important prince, the Prince Esterhazy, or the Prince of Esterhazy, who was extremely wealthy. When I say extremely wealthy, in his time, his wealth was legendary. There simply were no such things, even among the biggest of the big ones in the gentry. So almost unprecedented, almost unheard of. They owned land all throughout the region, Austria, Hungary, and it was an extremely wealthy and powerful and well-connected family. In fact, that prince was richer than the king and the emperor himself. That's how big he was. And besides for being exceedingly rich, he was a little bit of an eccentric, definitely kind of an interesting and unusual fellow, definitely for the times, but maybe even in our times you don't see that so much. One of his specialties was, or the unusual things about him, was being a music maniac. So he loved opera and he loved chamber music, while chamber music was in large part developed by Haydn himself. It was a nascent musical style at the time. And he was also an innovator in many other areas. One of the areas that he innovated is that he treated other people like human beings, which was not very common at the time. And that included even his entourage, the people who worked for him, not just the high-placed people, but even the low-placed people. He was involved in his business enterprises, which also was not common. Typically, noblemen were just sitting around and having fun all day. This guy was very, very hands-on, involved in all his agricultural businesses, and he knows what was going on, what was coming in, what was coming out. So no surprises here that he was able to enlarge and maintain his wealth, unless many wealthy people in his time who just pissed it off and eventually lost it from the family. So he didn't take it for granted. He implemented a lot of innovations in his enterprises. He innovated SOPs, standard operating procedures, giving instructions to the people, down to the actual agricultural enterprises, gathering the grain. He paid attention to the granaries. He implemented all kinds of methods and processes to prevent or to catch grain rotting or going to waste. He gave instructions on what padlocks to use in the granaries and periodical inspections. So very, very special guy. And so he hired Haydn to his services. At that time, he already did have a musical director, and that musical director was already starting to slow down. And in the beginning, in his service, there was some friction with Haydn, meaning between Haydn and the prince. And but that kind of calmed down and came to an end, and the prince took a lot of liking to Haydn. So he liked him and helped him develop and promoted him. And finally, when the previous musical director died, he gave that position to Haydn himself. And as the musical director, he had some freedoms that others didn't have, which is also pretty unusual in those days. In those days, there were distance between people. There weren't so immediate relations. You couldn't just talk to someone, but the reins of Haydn himself were released. And his fame and fortune grew, both materially and conceptually as a musician, as a composer. He made a lot of compositions, a lot of symphonies, a lot of chamber music. As I mentioned, he didn't really invent that musical style or convention, but he definitely was very, very instrumental in developing and disseminating him. Today, if you say chamber music, typically Haydn comes to mind, at least in the high classical circles. And he became the manager of the orchestra. The prince liked to come to listen to the orchestra, and so the wealth and the fame that he achieved in his lifetime is unprecedented through all of the classical periods. So from before him was the Baroque period of Bach, and he did get to meet Bach's either son or brother. There was a Bach Jr. who was Bach. If I don't remember if it was a brother or a son, but he definitely got to meet him. But be it as it may, no other classical composer down even to the modern era, even including Stravinsky and Rachmaninoff and Shostakovich, all of these, none of them had the fame and the adulation and the renown and the admiration and the respect that Haydn had during his lifetime. So that's an absolute anomaly. Of course, there are kind of stories, urban legends about Beethoven or maybe even Mozart dying alone and destitute. That's not true. They were known and famous and to some extent also wealthy to some part of their lives. But so those stories, I think that there's a story circulating out there that Beethoven's funeral was only attended by his dog, which is not true. So there were people, but still, compared to the fame of Haydn, that was nothing. And towards the end of his service with this prince, like I mentioned, the prince's name was the Prince of Esterházy, and in that region, it was a Hungarian noble family. So Esterházy is the name of their provenance. So this is the estate of that. It's named after an area. So Esterháza means the house of Esther, and that's a province or a district in somewhere in Hungary. So that's where they stem from. Of course, at the time, last names, family names did exist, but they weren't implemented or legally used as we use them today. However, the actual family name is Sarkozy in Hungarian. And it's kind of interesting or maybe ironic that one of his descendants, one of this prince's descendants, was the guy Sarkozy who set up Dreyfus, right? The famous Dreyfus affair and the Dreyfus trial. So the guy who forged the message from Germany, who was the actual spy, was one of his descendants. And later on, the previous or two presidents ago, the guy who was president of France until 2012 was also one of his descendants. That's just as a unrelated trivia. But back to Haydn. Haydn was able to get freedoms that practically nobody else got. Interesting episode. Haydn has a symphony that's called the Farewell Symphony. And the story behind that is that this immensely wealthy prince, he had some lands out of his normal residence. So he had a vacation home. And he used to vacation there every year. He used to go somewhere, I think in Hungary, in the countryside. And again, there was one of his enterprises there. He supported some hospital and certain churches. He developed the area where he was vacationing, so he wasn't just going on the lake, but he built there something, a school. Wherever they went, they built these big sumptuous palaces that were very advanced for the period. Be it as it may, he used to go to a vacation and stay there for some time and then come back. And he used to take his entire entourage, which even today, that would be exceedingly expensive. So you'd have to be a multi-millionaire or billionaire to do such a thing, to take a whole about 60 to 100 people entourage with you, the servants, and the orchestra was part of that. So one year he took himself and he went on vacation, and he was not coming back. So normally his vacation was 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and in this instance he just forgot himself, not coming back. And the days and the weeks go by, and people look at each other, and you can't just walk over to the prince, hey, let's go. You can't even address him or talk to him. You have to be summoned and send a message maybe. So it wasn't that simple. And these people, they were family people. They had to go back to their family, bring them money, bring food. They wanted to go back, and time was just going on, and the guy wasn't moving. He was just staying where he was. He wasn't coming back from his vacation home. And so people came over to Haydn and they told him, look, you're close to the prince, you can talk to him, but hey, we gotta go home. This doesn't work like this. Enough already. And but apparently at the time, even Haydn wasn't in the position to just directly address him, or maybe even if he wanted, he didn't, or he could, he didn't really want to strain the relationship. So he wrote a symphony for him, entitled the Farewell Symphony, and he presented it to the prince. And that symphony is written so that all the instruments stop one after the other, so one by one, and he instructed the orchestra to finish their part, and whenever their part is finished, to blow the candle, take the score and the instrument, and leave. And so that's how they presented this symphony to the prince, and that's exactly what happened. And each one got to his part, finished his part, blew his candle off, took the candle, took the score, took the instrument, and walked out of the door. And until Haydn was left, the last one, there was one last solo instrument, finished his part, blew a candle, went out, and then Haydn himself did the same thing, and that's how the prince got the hint, and the token finally fell, and then he picked himself up and he left. So again, even that requires some audacity. The prince finally dies, and Haydn's reputation was immense at the time. He already had a reputation even in England, in London. And so the new prince also liked music, but he wasn't as big a music maniac as his father. So he really let Haydn do whatever he wanted, and that's when his really rock and roll persona came out. Oh, another important detail. Yeah, speaking of rock and roll, of course, this still happened during the time of the prince. So, like I said, this was a modernizer and innovator. He let people be who they were and left people alone, treated them with respect. So one of the things he did is Haydn had a mistress who was the wife of one of the musicians in his orchestra, right? And that was an open secret. So that in and of itself shouldn't be so surprising because degeneracy and depravity existed all throughout mankind. Even the ancient Egyptians, they had the privilege of banging their siblings. So it's nothing new about it, but being so open and brazen and being pushed to the masses is a modern thing. But be it as it may, this guy whose wife was Haydn's mistress wasn't one of the greatest musicians, and his wife wasn't the greatest vocalist, and yet the prince, because of the relationship, he let them stay. And it was kind of an open secret, which is a very, very rock and roll kind of behavior and status at the time. So even though in the French royal family there were way worse things, and even before that in the previous century, in the 17th, maybe even the 16th century, there was a lot of degeneracy and depravity going on, but it wasn't so open. That was what was special about it. It was open. It was openly known. Everybody knew. And Haydn himself was a nobleman. He was, for all intents and purposes, he was a regular employee. So that was one of his privileges and part of his fame and fortune. So again, like I said, Prince dies and he gets invited to London. There was a wealthy musician, Salomon, I think, who was also involved with Mozart and Beethoven and a lot of the contemporary composers. And so he arranged for him to go to London, which was immense at the time. International travel. Remember, this is a world not just pre-internet, pre-PC, pre-press, printing press. This is a world where trains were just in their infancy, maybe boats. I don't even think there was steamboats, maybe steamboats, mostly sailboats. So it's something incredible for someone from the inland to travel, and they arranged to travel for Haydn. He got to see the sea. Not everybody would see the sea, and anyone who was a couple miles away from the sea just would never get to see it, right? He gets to travel to London. They gave him a reception that was, in his time, quasi unprecedented for any human being, except maybe some super great, powerful dignitaries like kings and emperors. He got a reception. He got a crazy success, packed opera houses and concert halls, and he got all the honors and the respect that one could imagine or not imagine in their own lifetime. And he spent some time there in London, came back, got to travel again. He traveled to London twice before the turn of the century, so before 1800. Unprecedented, incredible fame and wealth in his lifetime, and he kept composing pretty much until his death in 1815, something like that, 25. Almost he composed and remained active until the very last couple of years of his day. So this just exemplifies you that you don't necessarily have to puke all over yourself or set your airplane on fire to be a great rock and roll star. And yes, you may say that, well, he didn't have the pink Cadillac of Elvis and whatever, all the antics of Axl Rose and Motley Crue. Yeah, that's true. But compared to his period, what he was and what he did was completely unheard of and unprecedented, and it was bigger than any of the modern contemporary or 20th century rock and roll stars have ever done. So There you go. Another example of that. If you think that it's new and incredible, I can assure you that Keith Richards and Mick Jagger and Jimi Hendrix and Van Morrison, all the people who are normally cited as the greatest rock stars in history, it could not hold a candle to Haydn. Not just music and not just composing classical music, but even as a rock star. He was a rock star in every fiber of him 200 years before the term even existed. So here's another little musical trivia idea for you. So there you go. Thanks for staying all this time. Catch you on the next one. Until then, rock on and on and on.